Welcome back to the Stigma podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hayes, and today's guest is somebody who I really look up to in the mental health, healthcare, investing space, co-investor of mine, an advisor, and a friend, Esther Dyson. She's the executive founder of Way to Wellville, which is a nonprofit project that's dedicated to really demonstrating the value of investing in health, including how the benefits of investing in health accrue over time and aren't really always accruing to the investors, the for-profit investors directly, which is something that we get behind at What If Ventures. I mean, especially with our focus on mental health and our long-term view on mental health and addiction. Esther spends a lot of her time investing in startups. A lot of them are in the health space. She has been on the board of a lot of companies that we've all heard of, from 23andMe to Meetup, Yandez, and a whole slew of others. She was an early investor in Square. So she's got a lot of early stage startup experience. And I feel like I keep bumping into founders who really have Esther's DNA every time I turn around in the mental health space. She's truly one of the most influential thought leaders in our space, and I'm honored to get to speak with her today. So without any further ado, Esther, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking to us today.
I'm delighted to be here.
I think in the healthcare investing world, I feel like nobody has the insights that you have. Nobody's been around some of the businesses that you've been around. And I'd love to have you just share a little bit of your knowledge and your experience and your history and how you found your way to this healthcare investing world.
Okay. I'll start by saying it's really more health than healthcare. I'm much more interested in keeping people healthy and, honestly, let's say defund predatory healthcare in favor of funding health and resilience. So I certainly want to deal with drug overdoses and addiction, but if there's a way to keep people not needing that kind of care, so much the better. If you can prevent people from getting diabetes with good food and taxing sugar, stuff like that, so that you don't need to treat diabetes, again, so much the better. And the challenge is, of course, that there are these two big disconnects. One is the timing. Have a healthy childhood with good parenting, and you're more likely to be a resilient adult much later. Pay for providing that healthy childhood, and society gets the benefit, but the entities that pay for it do not necessarily. So that ends up meaning we need to pay for health as a society rather than charge the individual. And two, it means we need to start thinking longer term, which we don't. But you asked about me. So I was a tech person for 25 years, had a newsletter and a conference, and then sold that in 2005 and became kind of an angel investor. It was sort of the beginning of the dude CEO worship culture, the internet. Everybody was so clever and Silicon Valley rocked. And I began to think, I'd like to do something that was slightly more useful. So I got interested in healthcare, and then, having started out as a journalist, I asked the obvious question, which is, why are we spending so much money on care, which is fundamentally repair, rather than on maintenance and investing in keeping people healthy? And that's what ultimately led in 2013 to starting Wellville, which is, for what it's worth, it's a nonprofit, but it's a project. Our goal is not to scale and become amazing. It's to work with 5 communities over 10 years and then scale by having other communities copy what we're doing, by having governments say this is worth paying for, by having people think long term and start investing in health. We've got 10 years, thank goodness, because we need it. I mean, ultimately, I want to work with the US government and the voters and the political leaders and the activists, and certainly the local community governments we're working with now. But in the poorer communities, they need funding, and there are rich communities and poor communities, and we need the rich communities that generate so much wealth to share it with the poor communities who still are the people who buy their products and send them employees and so forth. But we need to start investing the way we invest in public infrastructure. We need to invest in human infrastructure.
Yeah, why is there not? Because every single president does one of these big infrastructure bills, it seems like. Why has somebody at the federal level not come along and done a $10 billion, $20 billion, $100 billion health bill and just said, hey, we're gonna fix people. Forget the roads. Let's fix the people.
Yeah. Well, they don't know what health is. I mean, the things you need aren't, again, it's not more hospitals. And it's certainly not more John D. X Memorial Wing. It's more like the John D. X Healthy Eating Program, the John D. X, let's have better school food. Let's tax sugar. Let's not subsidize things that are bad for people. Let's subsidize childcare and mental health workers because they provide a lot more to society than just the short-term work they're paid for. But we don't subsidize them, and we don't price in the costs that sugar and tobacco, and I mean tobacco partly, but there are a lot of things that cost our economy a lot, and you're seeing the outcomes of all that now with COVID-19, that we don't price that into the product. So people get this cheap stuff that's bad for them.
I saw a documentary on Netflix. I'm blanking on the name right now, but in it, it talks about our diet and how we got away from fats and how we got away more into processed sugars. And one of the things that really struck me was that Michelle Obama, early on in Barack's presidency, did a lot of work to try to fix what kids are eating in schools. And by the time that bill and that effort got around to being passed and being executed, the food industry had gutted it to the point where it, had some benefits, but it got gutted by these lobbyists. Like, how are we ever going to get around that?
I mean, in part, believe me, there's lots of people working on this problem, but in part by, oh, look, those people in Muskegon, they launched a diabetes prevention program that ultimately operated countywide. And then this still hasn't happened. We got the food companies, the food retailers to work with us, and school lunches and breakfasts were so healthy. We should do that too. So we want to be an example and a model. I mean, the science is there, but the compelling stories, the kinds of things that actually change what people do and what they vote for, we want to be part of a documentary like that, but not just complaining, but actually showing this is what it looks like when, hey, the kids in the school are healthy. They're, and it's not just diabetes. It's also drugs and education. They're employable. They're happy. They graduate from high school. They get meaningful jobs. They go to college. They get married and have children. And people want to live in these places. That's what we're hoping for.
Well, where's the disconnect between getting dollars allocated for this? I mean, I can't imagine anybody hears you say that and goes, you know what, that's a bad idea. We shouldn't be well.
Well, I don't want to pay for all these poor people. They should do it for themselves. That's the problem. And I mean, what we're trying to do, we have this quadrant chart, and at the lower left, everybody needs a quadrant chart. There's basically what Yancey Strickler calls now me. And it's my money. It's my life. I want to eat what I want. Maybe I'm addicted to drugs. Maybe I'm just addicted to Facebook. The pattern is all the same. It's I want it and I want it now. And this is what I want for me. Then up on the top, there's sort of the benevolent billionaire. He's going to donate to his own grandkids' university so that they can get in. But he may see some poor guy in the street and give him some money. And then the guy in the street will take that money and probably use it to buy drugs or something that's not very good for him. So in the end, nothing long-term has really come from this benevolence and this generosity. Then you go to the right along the lower axis and you get the benevolent billionaire thinking long-term. He wants to live forever. He invests in longevity and life extension and all this great stuff for himself. But where we want everybody to go, of course, is the upper right-hand corner, where the benevolent people say, let's invest in society. Let's invest in schools, not just for my kids, but for all the kids. Because after all, these are going to be my employees. They're going to be my customers. They're going to be the people that my kids and my grandkids live with. I want to invest in a good society, not just in good descendants or in my own longevity. And if you actually do the math, that's the investment that gives the biggest, broadest return, but it takes a long time and you don't necessarily see it in your own pocket. But it's getting people to move from that. For me right now, which is fundamentally addiction is if you like, the epitome of it, sort of the essence of it. And there's a long spectrum between addiction and short-term thinking, and then the sort of broader, longer-term thinking with purpose, thinking broadly for the good of society in the future.
Who pays for this? Is it just the government has to do it, or are there ways for private industry to get involved here and think long term?
Private industry can totally think long-term, including how they treat their own employees. Clearly, companies that think long term and plan for the future and treat their employees better do better. But ultimately, society does need to pay for part of this. They need to pay for the schools and the facilities, the social infrastructure that makes people healthy. Business can provide a lot of this stuff, and business can operate childcare. They can operate parks and gyms and diabetes prevention programs. But ultimately, the population, the public needs to say this is worth paying for, and not just for me out of my own pocket, but for society, for my community, out of my pocket as taxes. Or if I'm very poor, I'm the beneficiary of it, and I get the support and training I'm going to need to become less poor and have a good job and contribute.
What are some of the tactical near-term next steps that we should be taking to get to this place as a society? And what are the separate question, maybe I'll ask it after this, but what's the strategic high-level sort of federal level programs that we need in place? And how do I on the local level help with the tactical stuff? And then who do I need to be supporting politically to get this done at the high level?
Well, at the high level right now, it's honestly, and I don't want to be partisan, but I have to, it's sort of the Democratic programs that are more focused on healthcare and social services and equality and equity, because there's huge inequity, both poverty, racism, just people. I'm a very lucky person. I got born lucky, and a lot of people didn't. And as individuals, we need to understand how lucky we are. As businesses, we need to treat our employees better. And the challenge, of course, is that businesses compete with other businesses. And I would recommend reading Zephyr Teachout's book.
What's the name of the book?
It's Break 'em Up. And it's, I'm less convinced that we need to break up the monopolies. I am totally convinced that we need to understand that a consumer paradise ends up being a worker's hell if the workers get paid so little that they can't afford to buy the things that they themselves are making, delivering, farming, producing. And we need to understand that when people say, oh, Facebook or Amazon, whatever, are benefiting the consumer, they may be, but they are also creating an unfair playing field for their actual customers, who are usually other businesses, whether they're advertisers or vendors of products or other things.
Well, how do we break that cycle of consumerism? Like, how do we get people focused on what actually makes humans well and happy?
By talking on podcasts. Just kidding. But that is what we're trying to do with Wellville, and in a sense what you're trying to do. And certainly the attention now being paid to mental health is extremely gratifying, even though there's a lot of work to be done.
There's a lot of lip service. There's a lot of podcasting. There's a lot of talking about it. There's a lot of, hey, when I'm elected, I'm going to do this. There's a lot of talk. There's not a lot of action. And I see it in every area of society, and certainly around mental health and addiction.
But I'm certainly hoping that some of this attention that's being paid will actually lead to a better understanding. You're funding a bunch of companies. There's clearly demand, whether it's from healthcare systems who realize people with mental health problems and substance abuse problems are much more expensive. Employers likewise. To some extent, the government sees it, Medicaid sees it, Medicare sees it. We need the public to understand how the money flows somewhat better. And we need to get back to a culture of purpose and thinking long term, rather than, what's the return this year? I was at a conference where one of the people from Medicare was talking about how Medicare Advantage and Medicare is now starting to reimburse on the basis of outcomes and return on investment. Like if after you look at the costs 2 or 3 years down the road, and isn't it great? And we now pay for diabetes prevention programs and so forth, even though Medicaid still doesn't. And I asked, well, that's great, but how come you don't look like 7 or 10 years down the road? Because mental health and diabetes, these things take a while. And he looked at me and he said, that's a really interesting question. I actually don't know. It's not legislation. We just never asked. And, that was the most startling answer of all. It's like it didn't even occur to them to think longer term than a few years.
It's got to be that they're not incentivized to think longer.
Well, that's true. I mean, and legislation and so forth. But I mean, they're not incentivized to do anything because they are not personally making the money. And the problem is, in general, politicians are addicted to votes and being in office. They don't have a long-term purpose. Community organizations are addicted to short-term grants. Businesses are addicted not just to profits now, but to this exponential growth, which is fundamentally, it's impossible to have exponential growth forever. And I mean, it's just like it's fundamentally impossible to get satisfaction when you're addicted to something, because the essence of addiction is you need it more and you need it again.
I'm an AA, and it talks about it in our book. AA is not for everybody. I get that, but for me, it's helped save my life. And it talks about this. It talks about how you go out, you do this thing. There's this big dopamine. The book doesn't say it in these words. I learned a lot of this in rehab, but you get this big dopamine hit, and then the next time you need dopamine, you say, I'm going to go do that thing that gave me dopamine. But then your brain says, oh, it's not working as well. You got to do more of it. And then every time you deal with past trauma that hasn't been dealt with, or every time you feel pain, every time you trigger fight or flight, every time something in your amygdala happens that triggers a fear or a survival response, the brain says, go get the dopamine release, but you got to get more than last time because it wasn't enough. And that's addiction. And we're not dealing with that as a society. And one thing that's funny that makes me mad is that I'm a recovering addict. I'm almost 2 years sober here in about a week and a half. And my thing is this: we talk about mental health all the time. And it's almost like mental health is less stigmatized to me. Addiction is still like, oh, you're an addict. That's some heavy stuff, man. I feel like we need to do a lot more work around addiction.
We do, but we also need to understand that addiction to drugs is only one form.
Yeah, addiction to Facebook, sugar, nicotine, it's all the same. There's a guy this guy gave us, I have a video, I'll link it in the show notes. There's a guy that gives this 1 hour presentation. He's on the board of the rehab center I went to. He got thrown out of the Navy because of his addiction to painkillers, and he was a flight surgeon prescribing them to himself. And he explains that he talks about alcohol and cocaine in his presentation, and then he flips the slide, and it's everything from sugar to exercise. Anything that releases dopamine can cause a problem.
Yes, but it's not just dopamine in humans. It's the same pattern with businesses, with politicians, with these people on TikTok, the attention economy. I'm an influencer. I need more followers. And again, the community organizations need more short-term grants because that's how they live. And what everybody needs to do is think long-term with purpose.
It's almost though like that's a circular issue though, because you can't think long-term with purpose if you're not well.
Yeah, the narrative arc has become an endless loop.
How do we break it? How do we get people to think long-term about being well? And how do we get people well so they can think long-term?
Yeah. Well, obviously the best way is to start out when they're kids and just teach them, model it, let them understand, work hard today and you get these rewards tomorrow. You get to build something, you get to go to school and become, have an exciting job in mind. I mean, but if you grow up in straitened circumstances and everything's on alert and you're always struggling, you're not stupid if you take the first marshmallow. You're learning. And so much of addiction is learned behavior. It's not moral failing. It's what you learn. And, the way to fix it is, hey, it ain't easy. But perhaps the best thing to say is the opposite of taking drugs is not sitting around not taking drugs. The opposite of taking drugs is having meaningful relationships. It's having a job. It's having a purpose. It's having a sense of agency.
For me, one thing I figured out, it took me a while, but like in AA, it's not about not drinking. It's about a new way of life. The result is that you don't need that thing, that alcohol or the drug or whatever it is anymore.
I mean, there is physical dependence and they are interconnected, but the pattern of addiction is separate from the substance that you're addicted to.
Absolutely. My sponsor explained this to me last week when we were sitting down at his house. He said, "Look," he said, "let's talk about your 40 years on this planet. Let's talk about all the times your life has been hard and unmanageable." And guess what? That started at 0 and has gone all the way to 40. But then my drinking period was from about 18 till about 38. Well, why was life hard before I drank? And why has it still been hard since I drank? So it's not the solving for drinking wasn't the problem. Now, this way of life and my consciousness about addiction, I have not been drinking, but my problem is that I was living my life in a really garbage way, and I had to fix that. And the dependent variable of that equation was that I don't drink anymore. For me, it took brutal pain to be willing to make that change. And I just don't know how do we get society to start making changes like that? How do we get people, corporations, governments to change without brutal pain, or is brutal pain the answer? I mean, maybe no, maybe I'll get in trouble for saying this, but maybe we need to go burn shit down in the streets. Maybe we need to feel some pain so that people will finally be willing to change. I don't know.
Right now, the burning stuff in the streets is about racism more than it is. I mean, clearly, all these problems are interconnected.
Absolutely. I think they're all interconnected. I think if we solve for health, a lot of our societal problems get solved.
Yeah, but we need to solve for health of poor people. And part of the problem is the inequity leaves so many people behind.
So where do we go? What do we do next? What are the marching orders for different folks? So like what about for someone who doesn't have a lot of means, the average person, what do they do to help? And then if you do have means, what should you be doing to help? What do we all need to be doing right now?
Well, if you don't have a lot of means, take care of yourself. And this is easier said than done. Find an employer who respects you so that you respect yourself and, love your family. And if you have family problems, get counseling. A marriage is not the right two people finding one another. It's two imperfect people building something together with each partner contributing 60%. And if you understand that, life isn't supposed to be perfect, but if you learn how to communicate with other people, then you can actually be happy with the people you love. So many times you end up being unhappy with the people you love because you're so bad at communicating, or you have habits. And like everything else, loving other people, loving them comes naturally, but communicating effectively and living with them and working with them doesn't. And that natural human need for connection needs to be buttressed by an education on how to deal with the other person's moods, how to deal with your own moods, how to listen. It doesn't come naturally. For some people it does, and they're the lucky ones whose parents probably taught them.
What about us as investors? What do we need to be doing?
Well, invest in companies that have honest business models. Again, defund predatory healthcare, fund companies that make money by doing good.
Let's start with that term. What's predatory healthcare?
Basically companies that get rich as long as you stay sick, as opposed to companies that get rich when they help you get better.
So like companies that own 500 addiction treatment centers?
It depends how they're run.
I think some of the people that own or operate addiction treatment centers are the most, they have the least incentive for me to get well. They want me to come back 3 times, 4 times until I die.
Some of them, exactly. Yeah. I mean, again, you need to make the distinction between predatory ones and, addiction centers that are honorable are great. Addiction centers that aren't are a scourge of humanity. And you need to make sure you understand the difference. And that if you run a company like that, make sure you have investors who are aligned with your principles. Because what happens is you start out with the DNA of wanting to help people, and then the metabolism of trying to please investors takes over.
So that's interesting you said that. So make sure I understand the difference. As an investor, early stage, looking at startups, what do I need to be looking for so that I can see the difference? What are the tells that I'm funding something that may end up predatory?
Well, one is obviously talk to the founders, the team, their backgrounds, their motivations. If they always wanted to be CEO, that's not a good sign. If they want to get rich, it's not a good sign. They don't need to be Mother Teresa, but ideally, you have to have a good BS detector. Second, make sure that the people who invest alongside you are also honest people. Because as I said, sometimes the investors make companies do bad things. Again, the investors are addicted to profits and they say, okay, why don't you just market this a little more? And if you're going to publish your results, just talk about the ones that worked out. Be wary of the company you keep, and especially in the field of addiction. It's extremely it's predatory because people are so easy to abuse, and it attracts people.
I think a lot of the people that I see founders and investors that I see going after addiction have found their way to it recently. It's become a buzzword, especially around opioids. But I don't know how to say this, but I run into founders and investors in this space who've never been to a AA meeting. They've never been to rehab. They've never used alcohol. They've never felt the problem or the pain, or had a loved one or a family member, they're in the space for money. And I smell it so fast. And I just want to say, listen, I respect that you're trying to help, but I mean, I almost died from this stuff. You just don't get it.
It's not that you have to be addicted to have a pure heart. I mean, and that's the trouble. It's not that easy to tell. And that's why you really need to do your research and know the people. And again, know the people investing alongside you.
Yeah, that's really important for me. And I run into issues sometimes with investors because they look at me and they go, yeah, well, you've only been sober for 2 years, or you used to be an addict. How do I know you're going to be okay? And what I usually tell people is, well, you don't, first of all, and I can't make any promises. And second of all, listen, I felt the pain. And I've seen what's worked for me. I've seen what's worked for my friends in recovery and my 12-step groups. And I'm going to invest in things that I think work based on my firsthand experience. Just the same way that big time fancy VC firms on Sand Hill Road invest in SaaS because they've been dealing with it for 20 or 30 years, or however long they've been dealing with it. I've been dealing with addiction for 20 years. And so I'm going to invest in it because I know it. And they kind of look at me funny sometimes. They're like, wait a second. So you want me to hand you a bunch of money and you're going to do what with it? The first investor meetings I had after rehab were laughable, to say the least.
Part of the point is, as an investor, your default is no. I mean, it's like you're not rejecting people. It's like an investment is an opportunity, but it may be a problem rather than an opportunity. And so until someone convinces you that it's an opportunity and an honorable opportunity, your default should be no.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to do that. And especially, with the success rate that we see in the early stage space, I mean, you got to pass. You have to pass. You have to pass on a lot of deals. And for me in this space, my filtering mechanism is pretty straightforward. Would it have worked for me? That's filter number one. And then after that, there's some sort of industry specific filters I go through. But most of the things I look at that come through my inbox, I don't think it would have worked for me. So I'm not going to invest in it because I just can't believe in it if I don't think it would have worked for me. Now, that's a pretty broad definition. And when I say work for me, I mean, would it have worked for my friend in AA who would have done it differently, or my buddy in Narcotics Anonymous who it would have worked differently for her or for him? It's not just me personally with my biases. I don't mean to say that. It's based on what I know about addiction recovery. Do I think it would work? Maybe that's a better way to say it.
It doesn't matter. You may be missing a lot of stuff, but that's okay because believe me, there are more opportunities out there than you can afford to invest in. And so, I mean, that's why I tell people I'm not rejecting them. I'm just not saying yes to this opportunity. I don't do things with pets. I don't do women's fashion. People always think, oh, she's a female, she must do women's fashion. And, I don't.
I hate the traditional venture world and I'm in it. So I don't know if that sounds funny or not, but I despise it. And it's the business I'm in. And when people think and act that way, it just makes me go, ugh, I hate my business. People are terrible. I mean, especially in this industry, especially because of that metabolism you talked about, that DNA of I've got to have more money. I've got to have more toys and resources.
It's not the DNA. It's the learned behavior and the metabolism.
I love that distinction. For me personally, I had bad metabolism before I went to rehab, before I started getting well. So I think maybe what that tells me is that those of us that have chosen this path of wellness, chosen this path
on an impossible task, find the ones that are educatable. It's like everything. You have to pick the things you can do and focus on those. I mean, I don't deal with environmental problems. I don't deal with we're focused on equity and health and how that gets paid for, I guess.
So let's say an entrepreneur walked in right now and said, I want to solve the most important problem in health. What would that be?
So I go back to what I just said in a sense. There's a lot of problems to solve. You got to solve the problem that's meaningful to you, and that's why you'll be good at it. If you try and solve the problem I think matters, I mean, that's what I'm talking about when I say talk to the entrepreneur, find out what is their mission. And if their mission is money, I wouldn't invest in them. If their mission is a particular kind of cancer because that's what their sister died of, that makes sense. I mean, there's enough problems for lots of people to be solving different problems. The ones I care about in particular do have to do with this, equity and the long-term thinking, finding purpose, because I think ultimately those are the foundation of being physically and mentally healthy. But I'm also involved in a cancer startup run by somebody who cares deeply about cancer, who would not be very good at dealing with addiction. And, other people are doing diabetes, which is similarly another huge problem. Again, I think the meta solution is thinking long-term about society as a whole, but the specific things you need to do in specific areas, there's a multitude of them and a multitude of people, each best suited to one or a few of those.
It brings me back to access then, because people are building things that are personal to them. That if they're doing so I'm fascinated with mental health and addiction because it's something I've dealt with. But how do I, as an investor, focus on the thing that I'm familiar with, but also I don't get blinded by access and bias? Like, how do I stay focused on access for everyone and build sustainable businesses? I mean, what don't I know that I should know? Where am I going to make a mistake? If accessibility is my goal, how do I achieve that? Maybe that's a better question.
Well, understand that accessibility is both pricing and it may mean figuring out reimbursement. And it also means understanding that there are cultural differences and, the thing that suits you as a white guy might not suit a Latina woman who's got a different culture, would prefer to speak Spanish, stuff like that. Understand that reaching people doesn't just mean offering something, it means talking to people in their own context and listening to them. There's a range of business models, and it's great for people who can afford it to pay for stuff. It's also really important to figure out how to find a business model and make the case for outcomes-based payments for people who can't afford it, so that employers or the government or, again, society pays for things that ultimately have a long-term benefit.
Along those lines, what do you think health and healthcare, I know those are different, what are they going to look like in 20 years? What do you hope they look like in 20 years?
I hope we'll have a lot more health and a lot less care and need a lot less care. Again, I hope that so much the situation for kids will have changed, whether it's realizing through coronavirus that people with chronic health conditions are extremely vulnerable and ultimately extremely expensive, with people realizing they want to live in a country where they feel proud of how people are treated, where there is economic mobility and people are educated and we trust our government again. And that is public health writ large. That's a healthy society. Right now we have General McRaven and Colin Powell and people like that saying our education system is a national security issue. Let's have a country we're proud of.
I agree that I think education is broken. I think education is, if we don't get education right, then how do we tee up the next generation to solve the problems? We can't keep up. We can't keep up with the rest of the world if we're going to have a broken education system. If we're going to, teach kids to eat garbage and make them all obese and not teach them anything they need to know by the time they're 18, then what do we expect out of them? We just want to stick them in colleges where they don't learn anything, saddle them with a bunch of debt so they feed the corporate bureaucracy that obviously isn't working.
Nope. And it's all becoming clearer. So with luck, 20 years from now, this will have been the period of enlightenment.
That would be something else. That'd be really great. I have a 5-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'd love for them to be in their early 20s in a different world, and the place be totally different. And look, my area of focus is mental health and addiction because it's really the primary reason is because it's part of my own program. Going out and working on this stuff and trying to help people is part of how I stay sober. It's the 12th step. It's service. So, I'm hopeful that I'm able to do my part. And I think if we all keep these things in mind, like what you say about predatory healthcare and being conscious of who we're co-investing with, and thinking about access, and access isn't just offering a solution, but it's listening and really providing something that makes people well, and not necessarily doing it because we reap a financial benefit. I want to live in that world. I got to figure out how to make that world happen.
We all do. And with luck, at least some people will listen to what we were just talking about and say, yeah, I like that.
And I do think, we made light of it, but I do think that just having this conversation, just having a Stigma podcast, just talking about these things out loud in the open, every single time, every single person hears someone talk about addiction or health or wellness or mental health or bipolar disorder or whatever it may be, it gets us a little more normalized in the conversation. And I think people will become more and more willing to hear politicians run on platforms that are built on solving those problems. And I do hope that in 20 years, you'll see entire presidential campaigns built on how we're going to help provide access to mental health care, whether it's universal care or whether it's something else. I don't know. And politically, I don't care what the solution is. I just know that there are a lot of people dying. The root cause is that they haven't dealt with their own mental health and well-being, and we're not making care available to them. There's unlimited demand and there's not a lot of supply. And that's a problem I want to try to solve.
I'm with you.
I just want to say one more special thank you to Esther for being here today, for all that you've done for our industry, for our space, for healthcare, and for those of us who are trying to pave the way in this space. And for all, just thank you so much. And thank you for being on the show as well. I think a lot of people will find your insights helpful. To our listeners, thank you for being here. And please, if you like the content, hook us up with a subscribe or a like or a review on your podcast platform of choice, and share us with a friend. If you'd like to support us in the content we create, then you can find us on Patreon as well. We'll provide a link to that in the show notes. What If Ventures just launched our new rolling fund on AngelList, and we'd love to share more with you about that. We really want to educate you on our mission. We want to educate you on what a rolling fund is and help more people come to the venture asset class as it democratizes. So there'll be a link in the show notes where you can learn more about that and connect with us. To the founders out there, don't forget to join the Mental Health Startup Slack community. You can find a link to that in the show notes as well. And we have a new segment on the Stigma podcast where we feature 5 3-minute pitches from founders in the mental health space. We call it the Founder Spotlight. Nothing is filtered, nothing is edited. And really, we're just trying to leverage our platform to bring more awareness to more founders in this space. So look for a link to that in the show notes where you can sign up to submit your 3-minute pitch and be on one of those episodes. And most importantly, we really want to hear from you. We want to know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you agreed with, disagreed with. You can reach us on Twitter at StigmaCast, Instagram at Stigma Podcast. You can email us info@stigmapodcast.com. And that's it. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay safe, be well, and thank you for your support.